Now I have everything I need. Let me write the new story. My sister didn't just embarrass me at her engagement party. She used me like a prop. She came to find me near the back of the room. I was standing by the window with a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, watching the harbor lights smear across the dark water outside. And she hooked her arm through mine the way you'd grab a coat off a rack. "There's someone I need you to meet," she said. Her voice had that particular brightness she reserves for people she's trying to impress. I should have pulled my arm back. I should have said no. I'd learned years ago that when my sister wants to introduce me to someone, it isn't for my benefit. But I didn't say no. I never do with her. That's the thing about family. They know exactly how much rope you'll allow before you pull back, and they use every inch. The party was at a waterfront venue in Charleston, South Carolina. One of those converted warehouses with exposed brick and Edison bulbs and a catering staff whose uniforms cost more than my first car. My sister Isabel had gotten engaged 3 months earlier to a man named Preston Whitfield, whose family had been in maritime shipping along the southeast coast since before any of us were born. The kind of old money that doesn't talk about money, just talks about boats and charitable foundations and legacy. My parents had been glowing about it since the night Isabel called them. My mother had cried, apparently. My father had opened the good bourbon. I had sent a card and meant it. I'm Laurel. I'm 31 years old. I hold a master's degree in civil and systems engineering from Georgia Tech, and for the past 6 years, I've worked independently as a port infrastructure consultant. What that means in plain English is that I look at the way cargo moves through ports, terminals, cranes, berths, drayage routes, container flows, and I find what's broken before it costs someone a catastrophic amount of money. I've worked with port authorities in Savannah, Baltimore, New Orleans. I've rebuilt scheduling logic for 2 mid-Atlantic container terminals that had been hemorrhaging money for years. I once found a $4.2 million annual loss inside a drayage contract that everyone had been treating as a fixed cost. I don't post about it. I don't have a LinkedIn that lists my clients. Operational consulting in port logistics is not a field that loves publicity. Most of what I know is protected by NDAs, and most of what I find would embarrass someone powerful if it became public. I walk quietly, and I deliver, and my phone rings because of that. My family thinks I fiddle with spreadsheets. My mother once explained my job to a neighbor as something with maps. My father, when pressed, describes me as in logistics with the slightly apologetic tone of a man who wishes I'd gone to law school. And Isabel. Beautiful, charming, perfectly social, Isabel introduced me to her fiancé's mother last Christmas as my little sister, the one who didn't really figure out what she wanted to do. I was standing right there when she said it. I smiled and shook the woman's hand. That's the thing about being the quiet one. People say the cruelest things without lowering their voices because they've decided you won't push back. The engagement party was 120 people in a room that smelled like gardenias and good wine. Isabel had floated through it all night in a pale green dress, her hair in a loose updo, laughing and glowing and accepting compliments like she was collecting them. Preston stood beside her, looking exactly like what he was, a tall, pleasant, slightly wooden man who had inherited more than he'd built, but who seemed genuinely fond of my sister, and that, I decided, was what mattered. I had found my corner. My corners are comfortable to me. I'm not unsocial, but I've learned to read rooms quickly, and this room had no particular use for me. So I stood by the window and I watched, and I thought about a rail-to-port transfer problem I was still untangling for a client in Virginia. That's when Isabel found me. "There's someone I need you to meet," she said, arm already through mine. I set my water down. "Who?" "Preston's uncle. He's here from Houston." She stared me sideways without answering fully, which I recognized as her technique for preventing objections in transit. "Why do you need me specifically to meet Preston's uncle from Houston?" "Because he asked about you," she said, and something in her voice shifted. A half step sharper, like a blade turning slightly in the hand. "I told him about you." I almost stopped walking. "What did you tell him?" She laughed and patted my arm. "Oh, just the truth, Laurel. Don't make it weird." We reached a cluster of men near the bar, and Isabel peeled away from my arm smoothly and stepped forward with her public smile fully deployed. "Mr. Hartwell," she said warmly, "I wanted you to finally meet my sister." The man who turned was in his early 60s, compact, silver-haired, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years spent outdoors near water. His jacket was plain and expensive. His handshake, when Isabel gestured to me, would have been easy and direct. But he hadn't spoken yet. Isabel had. "This is Laurel," she said, and then with a small laugh that she had clearly rehearsed in her head as charming. She never really landed anywhere professionally. She does a little consulting here and there. We're not sure it counts as a job. Another small laugh. We love her anyway. There it was. My mother appeared at my elbow from nowhere the way she does, materializing in rooms when precision cruelty needs a second. "Laurel's always been more of a homebody," she added pleasantly. "She didn't really go the career route." My father, at her shoulder, chuckled in a way that was meant to sound affectionate. "She keeps herself busy," he offered, which was somehow worse. I kept my face still. I had practice. I knew every version of this performance, the gentle diminishment, the affectionate dismissal, the familial comedy routine in which I am the punchline who is supposed to laugh along to prove she's in on the joke. I had watched this routine my whole life and never once found the right moment to shut it down. The man named Hartwell had gone very quiet. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't doing the polite visitor thing of pretending he hadn't heard. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, not pity, not amusement, something more careful than either. His eyes moved over my face the way you look at a word you've seen somewhere before but can't immediately place. "What kind of consulting?" he asked. His voice was low and direct. My family laughed slightly, the preemptive laugh of people who expect my answer to be underwhelming. "Port infrastructure," I said. "Terminal operations, cargo flow optimization, berth scheduling. Right now I'm mostly focused on container throughput bottlenecks in mid-Atlantic and southeast ports." Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind where a room has shifted and hasn't caught up yet. Hartwell's expression changed. Fully, clearly, the way weather changes when the front actually arrives. He went still in the way that has nothing to do with stillness. It was the stillness of a person reassembling something in their head at speed. "Laurel," he said carefully. "Your last name." "Voss," I said. His jaw moved once. His eyes didn't leave mine. Around us, the party continued. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. And Hartwell and I stood inside what felt like a different kind of air. "Er Voss," he said slowly. And it wasn't a question. My heart did something irregular. Yes. He exhaled through his nose, not sharp, not dramatic, measured, like a man who has run companies for 30 years and learned that the most important moments deserve the most important moments, deserve the most careful response. He turned to my sister and my parents. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has just understood something and has no particular interest in being impolite about it. "Would you give us a minute?" he said. It wasn't a question either. His name was Gerald Hartwell. He was Preston's mother's older brother, and he had spent 35 years building a maritime logistics firm based in Houston that now operated cargo terminals in 6 Gulf and Southeast Coast ports. He was, I would later understand, one of the 3 most influential people in Southeast coastal shipping, though he carried it the way old money people carry everything without announcing it. 3 years earlier, the port of Brunswick had nearly come apart. A Category 2 hurricane had stalled off the Georgia coast for 4 days, longer than any model predicted, and the backlog it created when it finally moved had compressed the terminals into a state of complete dysfunction. Containers stacked wrong, dwell times exploding, rail connections missed, trucking companies pulling out of contracts because nothing was moving, and demurrage was bleeding everyone simultaneously. The ripple had hit Hartwell's Brunswick terminal hard. He had contracts with 3 major retailers whose supply chains were time-critical, and those contracts had penalty clauses. I was not living in Brunswick in those days. I was in Savannah, renting a 2-bedroom house and working on a long-term capacity analysis for the Georgia Ports Authority. I had no contract with Hartwell. I had no connection to his Brunswick terminal at all. What I had was a habit. When I see a port system in collapse, my brain will not leave it alone. It isn't noble. It isn't some generous impulse to help strangers. It's the same compulsion that makes some people unable to walk past a broken thing without trying to fix it. I had been watching the Brunswick situation in the public data because it was an interesting problem. And somewhere around day 2 of the stall, I had started building a model on my own time at my kitchen table late at night after my contracted work was done. Port recovery after a weather event of that duration is a sequencing problem above everything else. You can't move all the stuck containers at once. You have to identify which cargo is most time critical, which berths can be cleared fastest, with the equipment available, which rail yards have slack capacity that hasn't been utilized because nobody thought to look sideways at the normal routes. You build a cascade. Clear one lane, use it to relieve the next, create flow where there was blockage, and work outward from there. My model wasn't pretty. It was a Google sheet that had gone beyond its natural size limit, plus 3 pages of typed logic notes, plus a hand-drawn network diagram I photographed with my phone. But the math was right. I had verified it twice, and I trusted it. I found a contact form on the terminal's website. I didn't have a name. I wrote a message that started, "To whoever manages operational continuity," and attached my files. I included 1 line of personal identification. L. Voss, Port Systems, Savannah. No further context, no ask, just the model. I pressed send and went to bed. I spent the next 2 days assuming it had landed in a spam folder. Then the storm moved and Brunswick began its recovery, and I watched the public data improve faster than anyone expected, and I told myself it was probably nothing to do with me. I did not hear from Hartwell for 3 years. Until I was standing in a converted warehouse in Charleston with my sister's laughter still hanging in the air. He took me onto the terrace. The harbor was dark and wide. Container ships lit up in the distance like floating cities. A warm wind came off the water. Inside, through the glass, I could see my mother watching us from across the room with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before, uncertainty wearing the shape of a smile. Hartwell leaned on the railing and looked at the water for a moment. Then he said, "We recovered Brunswick in 11 days. Industry standard for that class of disruption is 3 to 4 weeks. Saved approximately $2.8 million in penalties and something close to $4 million in contract value that would have gone to renegotiation." He paused. I gave our ops team credit for it publicly because I didn't know who had actually done it. I looked at the harbor. Something in my sternum ached in a way that was hard to explain. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something older and quieter than either. I had our attorneys look for the sender for about 6 months. He continued. L. Voss, Savannah. You know how many L. Vosses there are in Savannah, Georgia? A few, I said. He almost smiled. We found 7. None of them matched. The contact form didn't capture an email address because of a site bug we didn't know about. He shook his head. I owed someone a significant debt and had no way to pay it. I said nothing for a moment. How did you know it was me tonight? I asked. Just from the name? He turned and looked at me directly. I didn't know with certainty until you said port infrastructure. But L. Voss in Savannah, port consulting. When your sister said your name, I had a feeling. He paused. And then you described your work and I knew. I nodded slowly. The wind moved around us. What do you want to ask me? I said because I knew there was something. He smiled then fully for the first time, straight to it. He said, Good. He had a problem. One of his terminals, Port of Savannah, ironically, practically in my backyard, was showing cost patterns that didn't align with operations. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. In a specific set of container handling contracts, the numbers were slightly wrong in the same direction week after week. His internal ops team had looked at it and offered explanations. Labor cost variance, equipment age, volume fluctuation, and the explanations weren't wrong exactly, but they weren't satisfying. I think someone's making money inside the system, he said simply. I can't prove it. I can't even find it cleanly. But I've been in this business long enough to know what operational inefficiency looks like versus what theft looks like, and this feels like the second thing. He looked at me carefully. I'd like to hire you to find out. Independent. No one inside my company to know the scope of the engagement except me and my CFO. I looked at the harbor. The far lights of a container ship tracked slowly across the dock. What's the timeline? I asked. Take what you need. I told him I'd send a contract by the end of the week. We went back inside. My mother intercepted me the moment Hartwell walked away toward Preston's family across the room. She took my arm and steered me toward the wall with the efficiency of a woman who has spent decades managing the narrative of our household. What was that about? She asked, voice low and quick. Work, I said. Her eyes searched my face. What kind of work? A consulting engagement, the kind that pays. She blinked. With Gerald Hartwell? Yes. A long pause. Laurel. She adjusted her bracelet, which is what she does when she needs a moment to reposition. You know it would reflect on the family if there are any complications. I looked at her. What kind of complications are you expecting? She smiled, but her eyes were busy. I just mean this is Preston's family. Isabel's engagement. We want everything to go smoothly. Then don't introduce your daughter as professionally irrelevant to a man who's been trying to find her for 3 years, I said quietly. She stared at me. I didn't elaborate. I went back to my window. It took me 4 weeks. I worked the way I always work. Early mornings, late nights, the data open on both monitors, the logic building slowly from the outer edges of the problem toward the center. The Savannah terminal's operational records were detailed, and detail is where truth hides. The pattern that emerged was precise and patient. Certain container moves were being routed through a third-party handling contractor unnecessarily, short chassis moves that any competent terminal would handle internally. Billed out to an external vendor with thin documentation and a business address that turned out to be a registered LLC in Delaware with 2 employees. The contractor's invoices arrived consistently for amounts just below the automatic review threshold. The approval signature was the same every time. The name on those approvals was a man named Wade, the terminal's director of ground operations. I had never met him. I didn't need to. The data was its own testimony. I also found something I hadn't been asked to find. The Delaware LLC had a second client relationship to a freight brokerage that listed, as a minority interest holder, a shell entity registered to a trust in the name of Preston Whitfield. My sister's fiancé. I sat with that for 2 full days before I did anything. I'm not going to lie. The human part of me wanted to believe it was coincidence. That Preston had invested in something without understanding what it was. That he was peripheral to it. That a man who looked at my sister with something genuine in his eyes couldn't also be quietly bleeding a terminal for supplemental income. But I know what the data says and what it doesn't say. The data said his name was on a financial interest in an entity that was receiving fraudulent contract payments. The data didn't tell me what he knew. That was for the lawyers. I called Hartwell on a Thursday morning and told him what I'd found. There was a long silence on the line. Both of them, he said finally. Structurally, yes. The degree of knowing involvement. That's not mine to assess. Another silence. Does your sister know? I don't believe so, I said. But that's also not my assessment to make. He said he appreciated my integrity. I told him I'd send the full report that afternoon. He told me the legal team would handle the rest. I hung up and sat very still in my office for a while, looking at the monitors. My sister called that night. Her voice was different, stripped of its party room brightness. Just Isabel, 29 years old, scared. Laurel, she said, Preston called me. He says there's a legal situation. He says your name came up. My name came up because I found the problem, I said. He says it wasn't what it looks like. He should say that to Hartwell's lawyers, I said. That's who needs to hear it. Laurel. A pause. Why couldn't you just... She stopped. Just what? She didn't answer. I think she knew what she'd been about to say and couldn't say it out loud. Just stay in your corner. Just stay small. Just let it go. I was hired to find the truth, I said. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. It just took someone who was looking in the right direction to see it. She started crying then, not manipulatively. Just crying the way people cry when the shape of their life shifts without their permission. I felt terrible for her in the way you feel terrible for someone caught in a consequence they didn't make. She hadn't stolen anything. She had just, for years, looked at me the way our parents looked at me and hadn't thought about the cost of that either. I'm sorry, I said. And I meant it. I'm sorry about Preston. I'm sorry this is your engagement party week and this is what's happening. I genuinely am. But you still did it, she said. Yes, I said. I still did it. She hung up. My mother called the next morning. Her voice was cold and precise, which is the version she uses when she believes she's justified. You have ruined your sister's engagement, she said. Preston's choices ruined the engagement, I said. I just documented them. You could have come to us first, to family. The word landed the same way it always lands with them, like a claim, like a contract I signed without reading it and am now obligated to honor forever. I went to the person who hired me, I said. That's how employment works. This is not about employment. She was trying to keep her voice level. This is about what you owe the people who raised you. I sat in my desk chair and looked out my window at the stretch of neighborhood rooftops, kids on bikes in the street below, a dog barking somewhere. The ordinary, uncomplicated world that continues happening while families have their old arguments. What I owe you, I said carefully, doesn't include protecting fraud. And it doesn't include staying invisible when it's convenient for everyone else and then being useful when it's convenient for everyone else. Those aren't the same obligation. Silence. At your sister's engagement party, my mother said finally, her voice shifting, not to anger but to something quieter and more honest than she usually allows herself. Gerald Hartwell spent 40 minutes alone with you on the terrace. Yes, I said, and we were in there telling him. She stopped. Telling him I didn't have a career, I finished. A very long silence. We didn't know, she said. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she'd come to one in 31 years. No, I said. You didn't know because you never asked. You never looked. I let her have the silence to sit in. Then I said, I'm not angry, Mom. I'm just done performing the version of myself that makes it easier for everyone else. I hung up. Preston's legal situation took several months to resolve. The LLC was dissolved. Wade was terminated and subsequently charged. Preston's involvement, as I had suspected from the data, turned out to be more willful than passive. He had set up the original entity and had known what the payments represented. His attorneys negotiated a settlement, and he avoided prosecution in exchange for full cooperation and repayment. Hartwell made a public statement about the terminal's recovery and internal controls. My name wasn't in it, by my contract. Isabel called me 6 weeks after the engagement ended. She had moved back into her own apartment in Charlotte. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Not sad exactly, more like someone who has had something stripped away and found the underneath survivable. I want to understand what you do, she said. Can you explain it to me? For real this time? So I did. I talked for almost an hour about systems and flow and the way data tells true stories if you're willing to follow them. About port infrastructure and what it means for supply chains and commerce. About the Brunswick hurricane and the model I'd built at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. just because I couldn't help it. She listened. She asked real questions. At the end, she was quiet for a moment. That night at the party, she said, what I said to Hartwell about you, I thought it was harmless. I thought I was just being funny. I know, I said. I'm sorry, she said. Actually sorry. Not because of how it turned out. Because it was wrong. It wasn't enough to undo years of being the punchline of my own family story. But it was something. It was a start. Hartwell offered me a full-time position afterward, Director of Network Integrity, overseeing operational auditing across all 6 of his terminals. Generous title. Serious salary. Office in Houston with a view of the ship channel. I thanked him and turned it down. He wasn't surprised. I figured, he said. You're not a position person. I'm not very good at reporting structures, I admitted. He laughed. Fair. We drew up a long-term independent consulting arrangement instead. A retained engagement with Hartwell Maritime, scope defined by me, outcomes as the metric. It meant I kept my row house in Savannah, my 2 monitors, my habit of working late when a problem has teeth. It meant I stayed the person who sees the system from outside. That's where I'm most useful, and it's where I'm most myself. A few months after everything settled, I was driving through the neighborhood where I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. No reason in particular. I had a client meeting nearby and took a detour through old streets. I passed the house, same brick, same magnolia in the front yard, same absolute plainness of a place that holds a complicated history. I thought about the engagement party, about Isabel's arm through mine, steering me across that beautiful room, about her voice, bright and practiced, saying she never really landed anywhere professionally to a man who had been looking for me for 3 years. It used to feel like a wound, being described that way, like something taken from me. Sitting in my car outside my childhood house, I realized it didn't anymore. It hadn't been taken. It had never been visible to them. And invisible things don't disappear. They just wait. In the data, in the work, in the problem you solve at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning because something in you can't leave a broken system alone. People will tell you who you are because it's simpler than seeing you. Let them. Then go fix something that matters. The record will catch up eventually. I've thought a lot about the moment Gerald Hartwell said my name back to me. Elvos, quietly, carefully, like he was handling something he'd been trying not to drop for 3 years. And I've thought about the fact that 30 seconds before that, my sister was laughing while she told him I'd never really figured out what I wanted to do. Both of those things happened in the same 60 seconds. That's the part I keep coming back to. Here's what I understand now that I didn't fully understand then. The way people treat you is almost never actually about you. Isabel didn't introduce me that way because she had carefully evaluated my career and found it lacking. She introduced me that way because it was easy. Because I had never pushed back hard enough to make it costly. Because in the economy of our family, I had always been the one who absorbed the loss quietly so everyone else could feel like they were winning. It wasn't malice, exactly. It was laziness. The lazy cruelty of people who have never had to think carefully about the person standing next to them. And I had let it happen. That's the part that's harder to sit with. I had stood in rooms for years while my value was quietly subtracted from the conversation, and I had smiled and said nothing because confrontation felt like it would cost more than silence. What I didn't account for was the compounding interest on silence. Every time I said nothing, I made it easier for the next time. I trained the people around me to believe that I didn't mind, that I had accepted the version of me they'd invented. I hadn't accepted it. I had just stopped fighting it out loud. And those are not the same thing. What changed wasn't Gerald recognizing me. What changed is that the truth had already been building quietly in the work. Every problem I solved, every system I repaired, every model I built at 2 in the morning because I couldn't leave a broken thing alone. That was the record being written in a language my family didn't speak but the world did. Gerald had been holding that record for 3 years. He just hadn't known where to return it. The thing about integrity, the real kind, not the kind people perform on social media, is that it doesn't need an audience to function. I sent that hurricane model to a generic email address with no expectation of credit. I did it because the problem was there and I could see it. That's it. There was no strategy. There was no long game. There was just a person who can't walk past a broken system without trying to understand it. And years later, in a room where my own family was using me as a punchline, that quiet work came back and stood up for me louder than I ever had for myself. I don't think that's luck. I think that's what happens when you keep building something real while everyone around you is focused on appearances. Reality is patient, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand recognition on your timeline, but it doesn't disappear either. It waits in the data, in the record, in the work that outlasts the moment everyone decided you didn't matter. What I want you to take from Laurel's story, from my story, isn't that justice always arrives dramatically, though sometimes it does. It's that the most powerful thing you can do when people try to shrink you is to keep growing anyway, not to prove them wrong, not for the revenge of it, but because the work itself is worth doing and you are worth the full version of your own life. Stay honest even when honesty is inconvenient. Stay curious even when no one is applauding the curiosity. And when someone hands you a corner to disappear into, build something in it instead. The record catches up. It always does.